Not slaves, workers, paid in the currency that mattered. Enough bread for 10,000 workers, per Dalton U, for 20 years. Paris, October 5th, 1789. 6 in the morning. 7,000 women marching to Versailles in the rain with pikes. The harvest had failed. The flour was gone, and so they marched, fishwives, laundresses, seamstresses. They aren't soldiers. They woke up that morning and found the bread market empty again. The price of a 4-pound loaf reached 80% of a laborer's daily wage, and so they marched 20 kilometers in the rain to drag the King of France back to Paris. They succeeded. Louis XVI returned to Paris 2 days later, surrounded by the mob. The royal carriages pelted with mud and bread crusts. The King of France escorted by fishwives. And it wasn't the first time bread had done this. And it wouldn't be the last. Before pottery, before farming, people were making bread. What they found at Chewbacca weren't farming settlements. They were hunting camps with bread ovens. The French Revolution is taught as a story about ideas. Liberty, equality, fraternity. What it actually was, at its root, was a bread riot that kept escalating. And it wasn't the first. This is the history of bread. Bread is not a simple food. It is a technology. The oldest evidence of bread making dates to 14,400 years ago. In Jordan, 4,000 years before the invention of pottery, 4,000 years before farming, hunter-gatherers were baking flatbreads from wild grain. The grain changed everything, not just what people ate, what they built their lives around. The wheat grain itself is nearly indigestible raw. You cannot live on raw wheat, but soaked, ground into flour, mixed with water, baked at heat, it becomes something else entirely. Agriculture, the deliberate cultivation of wheat and barley, may have begun for the sake of bread, not to eat raw grain, to make bread. The sequence historians assumed for centuries may be backwards. Bread came first, then farming followed to guarantee more bread. The sequence may be backwards. The demand for bread created the supply of wheat. Agriculture followed appetite. Ancient Egypt ran on bread. The pyramid builders were not slaves. They were organized labor paid in bread, beer, and onions. Archaeological evidence shows industrial bakeries capable of tens of thousands of loaves, per Dalton U, the caloric infrastructure of the greatest construction project in the ancient world. These were not slaves. This was a workforce fed, housed, and paid in bread. The Egyptians were likely the first to use leavened bread, risen with yeast. The result was lighter, more digestible, and, critically, better tasting than flatbread. Leavened bread requires wheat specifically. The protein in wheat, gluten, traps the carbon dioxide that yeast produces. You cannot make leavened bread from rice or corn or barley. Wheat is unique. Rice feeds you reliably. Wheat politics are volatile. A bad harvest is a political crisis. Rome understood the politics of bread better than any civilization before or since. The Roman grain dole guaranteed free or subsidized grain to citizens. From 123 BC. At its height, the annona fed 200,000 Roman citizens per month. Not because Rome was generous, because a hungry city is an ungovernable city. Bread and circuses, Juvenal called it. The two things required to keep the population from revolting. When the annona collapsed, when the grain ships stopped arriving, Rome fell. The city of 1 million people could not feed itself from its immediate hinterland. Cut the grain and Rome surrenders. Alaric understood this better than any general before him. The sacking of Rome in 410 AD was preceded by a grain blockade. A city of 1 million people cannot feed itself from its immediate hinterland. Every empire that controlled grain controlled the ancient world. Egypt with its Nile floods, Rome with its North African breadbasket. Napoleon, who lost both campaigns partly from bread failures. Cut the grain supply, and Rome surrenders. Every empire that controlled grain controlled the ancient world. The great medieval famines were bread famines. 3 consecutive years of crop failure. The Great Famine killed 10% of Europe's population. Lords could not feed their serfs. Serfs had no labor to offer. The feudal system buckled. The social order collapsed. The Great Famine killed before the Black Death. Then the plague arrived. Together, they ended medieval Europe as a functioning system. It all began with 3 bad wheat harvests. By the way, if you are watching this series, we've covered sewers, water, paper, salt, and fire. Bread built the cities all of those things ran through. Hit subscribe. Back to the story. The word Lord comes from the Old English Hoplaford, literally bread keeper. The word lady comes from HLIs, bread kneader. The entire vocabulary of medieval power was organized around who controlled the bread. The Lord kept the bread, the lady made it. Serfs owed their labor for the grain. In 1917, bread shortages in Russia triggered the February Revolution. Every great revolution in the grain-growing world has a bread line behind it. Paris, Petrograd, Cairo, 3 centuries, same empty shelf, same result. Not the Bolsheviks, they came later. First, women in bread lines in Petrograd began marching. The Tsar sent Cossacks to suppress the protests. The Cossacks refused. The regime fell in 10 days. 3 centuries of Tsarist rule ended in a bread queue. Russia's most radical political transformation in centuries began in a bread queue. The Bolsheviks arrived months later and took credit. The bread had already done the work. Napoleon said an army marches on its stomach. He lost Russia partly because of bread supply failures. Every empire that controlled grain controlled the ancient world. Every army that lost bread lost the war. Today, wheat feeds more humans than any other crop, over 700 million metric tons per year. The global wheat supply chain runs through a handful of countries. Russia, Ukraine, and the United States produce roughly half of global exports. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, wheat prices rose 40% in 2 weeks. The Annona that Gaius Gracchus introduced in 123 BC, they're still running it. The same political physics, 25 centuries later, still running on bread. Governments across North Africa and the Middle East began emergency rationing. The same political physics that emptied Paris bread markets in 1789 played out in days across a dozen countries. Simultaneously, bread didn't just feed populations. It structured every political arrangement that governed them. The person who controlled the grain controlled the city. Every taxation system, every feudal obligation, every imperial tribute organized around the one commodity every person needed every day. The person who controlled the city controlled the civilization. Every system of taxation, every feudal obligation, every imperial tribute organized around the question of who gets the bread and who pays for it. The market women of Paris understood this better than any philosopher. Modern civilization is one supply chain failure away from what Paris experienced in 1789. The supply chain is invisible until the day it isn't. Then it is all anyone talks about. You can tolerate a lot of injustice when you are fed. You cannot tolerate very much at all when you are not. The technology is 14,000 years old. The physics are identical to the first flatbread at Shubaika. The Annona runs in crisis zones today. Different name, same calculation. Feed the people or lose control. 14,000 years of this, the most consequential invention in the history of food. Still feeding the world. If you learned something today, hit like and subscribe for more hidden histories. Next week, the history of glass. Until then, history is everywhere.